A midnight feast of news and speculation burst upon the scene with David Davis's, I think, 10 minutes to midnight resignation from the British cabinet, followed by a Mr. Baker from a position nobody knew that he ever held. The British government's Brexit strategy now lies in ruins. The 17.4 million votes cast by the British people in the EU referendum, the largest number of people ever to vote for anything or anyone, seems about to be betrayed. And nobody knows who's going to take the post that David Davis has vacated. It was supposed to be announced at 9 a.m. It's now 10:06. Who will take the poisoned chalice of David Davis's position? And what happened in Amesbury? What happened in Salisbury? What happened with the Novichoks? And if any other group marched against any other group in the way that the Orange Order marched in Glasgow on Saturday, they would never do so again. If a cleric of any other faith had been attacked and spat upon by the members of the aforementioned group, there would have been an instant declaration of a hate crime and arrests of the alleged perpetrators. Didn't happen because we're talking about Scotland, the greatest wee country in the world, and the cleric was a Roman Catholic. A huge march of orange men and some women chanting, "We hate Roman Catholics," set upon a Roman Catholic priest, beat him and spat upon him. Did you know about that? No, you didn't. You didn't know about it unless you're on social media. And you didn't know that it was a hate crime because it wasn't designated by the Police Scotland as a hate crime until a day of intense social media activity of which I was a part. And will these boys all now come safely from the cave? All of this is coming up today. But the show will be dominated, I have no doubt, with what happens now on Brexit. As it happens, I know David Davis very well. David Davis is a friend of mine. I regard him as a highly principled individual. I had no doubt that he would refuse to go to Brussels to negotiate Brexit in name only. Why would he? That would make him a man utterly bereft of principles. That would make him Michael Gove or Boris Johnson. That would make him an actor, a man who had been playing all along. And David Davis is no actor. If he were, he might be rather more polished than the turds he's left behind. David Davis is a man of principle. David Davis is a real man of integrity. Now, Peter Oborne, the doyen of right-wing journalists in Britain, is coming up on the show at 10:40. He's already tweeted that he's coming on the show to consign Davis to the trash can of history. Well, maybe. Just maybe. On the other hand, this could be like that day that I sat on the green benches in the House of Commons and saw that dead sheep, Sir Geoffrey Howe, savage Margaret Thatcher in a way that broke her. Ministerial resignations of big beasts doesn't always trigger a leadership challenge, but when it does, boy, is it a leadership challenge. Geoffrey Howe's brilliant, wizard, cricketing metaphors broke Mrs. Thatcher sitting at the dispatch box, and I saw it happen. I saw her break under the withering fire of the monotone Sir Geoffrey Howe. There are similarities. David Davis is no orator. He's no sparkling, charismatic individual. He's no Michael Heseltine. But after Geoffrey Howe broke Mrs. Thatcher, it was Michael Heseltine that stepped forward and challenged. Now, of course, Michael Heseltine never wore the crown, but he ensured that Margaret Thatcher lost it. It may be that David Davis never wears the crown, but it will be he who has broken Theresa May. And beware of certain currents currently flowing. There's the current that recognises that Theresa May's Brexit in name only is no Brexit at all. The current, the FBPE, whatever it stands for, who have spent millions of George Soros's money to destroy Brexit, are fully behind the Prime Minister and in full spate in the rubbishing of David Davis. That's one current, represented by Sir Vince Cable, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, who'll be joining me in just a few minutes' time. But there's other currents. There's other currents of the sparkling, charismatic wannabes. There's the current that doesn't want Theresa May to stay, but doesn't want David Davis to succeed her, but wants Boris Johnson instead. There are even some, though they may be confined to his own household and one or two newspaper offices, who'd like Michael Gove, Iron Mike, to succeed Theresa May. And they'll be rubbishing David Davis too. There's even, I kid you not, a current that wishes to see a reluctant Jacob Rees-Mogg in his double-breasted silk pyjamas, his smoking hat, and his 18th century gait go through the gate of Downing Street, and they'll be rubbishing David Davis too. There's a Conservative Party meeting of some importance this evening. As I speak, I'm watching Jacob Rees-Mogg on my Sky Television screen. And I even heard Davis praise Theresa May today. Trust me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, Boris Johnson, Michael Gove and David Davis are now supporting Theresa May as the rope supports the hanging man. But the one man in waiting, patiently, quietly, cleverly, is Jeremy Corbyn. On Sunday's television shows, he was widely ridiculed in the face of yet another tide of unanimity amongst the commentators and the pundits, who talked of the wizard game that Theresa May had played at checkers on Friday. How she had confounded them all. How she had laid the Brexit ghost in its grave. Corbyn said, this doesn't even command support in the Conservative Party. And he said, and I quote, it may all unravel rather quickly. They laughed. Oh, how they laughed! All these pundits paid hundreds of thousands of pounds of your money to analyse events. Oh, how they laughed. Well, they're not laughing now, because the likelihood of a new British general election just stepped up into fifth gear, and the possibility of Jeremy Corbyn, Prime Minister of Great Britain, just became a lot more likely. Now, you didn't get a chance to talk on the last show before I took over, but I want to hear from you today. 0344 499 1000. 0344 499 1000. That's the number to call. If you call us, we'll call you back, put you on the radio, and it needn't cost you more than a penny or two. You can also email me via the website at talkradio.co.uk. You can text me. Text the word talk and then your message to 87222, though that will cost you 25 pence plus normal charges. But you can tweet me for free at George Galloway at Talk Radio. This is going to be the mother of all talk shows. It's just another Manic Monday. In fact, every time I'm standing in for someone, as I'm doing today for the great Mike Graham, all kinds of things burst upon the political scene. Keeps me in a job, keeps Talk Radio giving me the gigs. But I need your calls to let them know you're listening. 0344 499 1000. Or text me, or email me, or tweet me at George Galloway. Many people have, just while we're trying to reach Sir Vince Cable, the leader of the FBP. What does that actually stand for? FBPE. I never found out because I block them on site. Christina says George Galloway's on a radio special at 10 this morning to discuss the Brexit situation. And she goes further. General election 2018 now. Rob Morton said David Davis would be the worst postman in the world. Can't deliver. Well, won't deliver would be more accurate. Won't deliver something he doesn't believe in. And he's right not to believe in it. The Chequers Summit produced the murder of Brexit. Why would anyone with any self-respect, why would any Democrat with any self-respect want to deliver something that betrayed 17.5 million people? George, how anyone has the capacity for reasonable thought can think that the Russian state had anything to do with this latest poisoning? Do we take it that the original targets who were poisoned survived, but then 4 months later the same chemical, which incidentally is produced a couple of minutes down the road at Europe's largest chemical weapons establishment, manages to kill an innocent bystander after it should have degraded? Certain countries are pulling out all the stops to demonize Russia for geopolitical gain and to pressure countries partnering with Russia on the Nord Stream pipeline to pull out. The dirtiest of dirty tricks are being played here, with imbeciles from the government making outrageous and baseless claims with zero evidence. But conveniently, George, the more this is in the news, the less we talk about the disastrous Brexit negotiations. Well, not quite, Peter, because we're all not standing by and following back pro-EU. That's what it's FBPE. Now, the doyen of conservative writers in this country is undoubtedly Peter Oborne of the Daily Mail and of the Spectator. And he's on the line now. Peter, welcome.
Middle East Eye, George.
Middle East Eye. I forgot to add that to your growing portfolio of portals through which your great wisdom is issued into the British mainstream. Peter, welcome. Thanks for coming. Sir Vince Cable hasn't picked up, so you're on earlier than you expected. You told your followers you'd be on at 10:45 to consign David Davis to the dustbin of history. I've lifted the lid. Go ahead. So consign him.
Well, David Davis' resignation comes far too late. He was appointed. He campaigned for Brexit in 2016. He was rewarded for securing victory by being appointed Secretary of State for Brexit, in charge of the negotiations. He was handed on a platter, the opportunity to sculpt the Brexit that he wanted. And what did he do? He didn't pay attention to detail. He didn't turn up at the office. He flounced around London, going to sort of social events. He took his eye off the ball. His civil servants ran rings around him. And about a year ago, actually, Mrs. May took in negotiations herself. That was the moment when Mr. Davis should have scarpered. And I read, and even then, even on Friday, he swallowed the text about the new negotiating agreement, went off to Silverstone races, and only 2 days later, far too late, did he make his rather pathetic resignation announcement.
Well, that's quite strong stuff. Let's deal with the first point first. Although he was the Secretary of State for Brexit, in fact, the Prime Minister used the man who became her actual personal envoy to the EU, a civil servant, to sculpt, as you put it, the Brexit, not that the people had voted for, but the one that Theresa May, who'd voted against Brexit, wanted in its place. In other words, Brexit in name only.
Well, yes, I agree that she did that. She did that a long time ago, more than a year ago, I think. And that was the moment when Mr. Davis should have put his foot down and said, no, I'm the man in charge of Brexit. That's the moment when he should have said, either leave me in charge or I resign. To do it more than a year later, after he spent the last he's met Michel Barnier for 4 hours in the last 7 months. It's pathetic. You know, the Irish minister, the foreign minister, called him the coffee boy. You know, it doesn't matter if he resigns or not. He's allowed himself to be consigned to irrelevance.
Well, let's move back one stage to Friday, to Chequers. Do you agree with me that Theresa May's proposal that she prevailed on with at least the majority of her cabinet, and in the sense that nobody quit, you could say it then became the cabinet position, is, in fact, Brexit in name only?
Absolutely. I think that in many ways, she said Brexit means Brexit. What she might have said is Brexit means remain.
Yeah.
And that's because her vision involves Britain remaining in some version of the customs union, some version of the single market, some is still responding to the European Court of Justice and so forth. And that is not what she appeared to be saying when she made her Lancaster House speech. But I would just go into the dark arts of politics here. The way she has outmaneuvered the so-called Brexiteers in the cabinet, she has vaporized Boris Johnson. She has pulverized Andrea Leadsom. She has played the wretched David Davis like a fisherwoman in a salmon pool. I mean, it's a masterly political performance, George.
Well, that's right. She has, but then she was. Some might say she wasn't up against people of any great principle, of any great backbone, and you've made a good case in relation to Davis on that. The others, Boris Johnson, is no longer left standing as a potential Tory leader, in my view, unless he resigns today.
I'm afraid it's too late because he signed up to the negotiating position on Friday. That was the moment for Mr. Johnson to quit, and maybe before. And I think one of the major problems for the so-called Brexiteers, Johnson, Gove, Leadsom, Davis, and so, is they have not put forward an alternative plan. They have talked the language of hard Brexit or clean Brexit, but they haven't really delivered a position. And that they've had 2 years to do that. Meanwhile, Mrs. May, who's been allowing them all kinds of freedoms, has carefully gone along and sewed them all up, stitched them up. I think she's shaping up to be one of the most brilliant prime ministers.
Now, where does the Conservative Party, the 1922 committee, now stand. We read variously that more than 40 people have sent in letters effectively asking for a leadership contest. Will that now grow to 48?
I don't spend enough time at Westminster. I don't want to pretend knowledge that I don't have. I've read the same things that you've read, and I don't know. My instinct is that Mrs. May is far more trusted inside the Conservative Party and also in the country at large than any of the Brexiteers. I think that maybe she does need to have a fight, but I think she'd win it.
So this is not, therefore, a day of great historical moment like the one I talked about earlier when you and I watched Sir Geoffrey Howe break Margaret Thatcher in his resignation speech. It was said of him that being attacked by him was like being savaged by a dead sheep. But my goodness, he was ferocious and effective that day. And it led, in the end, to the defenestration of Mrs. Thatcher. From what you say, we're not in anything like the same kind of moment now.
Well, there's all sorts of complexity. I mean, history just never repeats itself in exactly the same way. For that to happen, you'd need Boris Johnson to play the role of the man he succeeded in Henley constituency, Michael Heseltine, and to leave the cabinet and challenge the Prime Minister. Even then, I don't think that the numbers would help him. I think what's very interesting, though, is we are seeing the beginnings of cross-party alliances. You've got the request by, I don't know if you've noticed this.
Yes, Labour, some selected Labour MPs are meeting her chief whip this afternoon.
Yes, now that can be a moment of historical significance, because that can be the thin end of the wedge, which would lead to the creation of a new party. And you can see now the potential. If Labour MPs are going to meet the Conservative chief whip, that is profound indeed. That is the seismic structures of politics reshaping themselves. That is an earthquake.
Finally, Peter, Dominic Raab has got the gig. He's the new Brexit Secretary. What can you tell our listeners about him?
He worked in the Foreign Office. Some people talked to as a legal advisor. He was not caught up in that appalling business ahead of the Iraq War. He is a clever man. Some people talk to him as a future leader of the party. Unlike the lamentable Davis, he is prepared. He has got the intellectual capacity to deal with detail.
Well, we'll see how it all spins out and talk to you again, I'm sure. Peter Oborne, thanks very much for joining us. Peter Oborne of Middle East Eye, The Spectator and The Daily Mail. There's a collection of cards, I must say. Well, there you had Peter Oborne's scathing, withering, devastating attack, not just on David Davis, thick, lazy, stupid, not in command of his brief swanning around at art galleries and other events. I'm not sure I've ever seen David Davis in an art gallery, but pay that no mind. As Peter has it, Theresa May has outmaneuvered, outfoxed everyone, including Fox. She has vaporized, he said, the Brexiteers in the cabinet. She has turned out to be an absolutely brilliant Prime Minister, says Peter Oborne of The Spectator, The Daily Mail and Middle East Eye. What do you think? 0344 499 1000. I must say I didn't recognise much of the reality as described by Peter Oborne, but that's what this show is about. It's the Open University of the airwaves. So join in 0344 499 1000. Now, let me go to the tidal wave of material coming in. Scouser Lar, my old pal, hope to see you at the St George's Hall on the 8th of September. Theresa May really cannot carry on any longer. It's now time for a general election and Jeremy Corbyn to become Prime Minister. Christina says Tory governments are very devious. Their true agenda is questionable. In some respects, I feel maybe their plan was to fail, to come up with a Brexit plan that was unworkable and unlikely to be accepted, either by the EU or the Tory party. Well, that's absolutely correct, Christina. There's no doubt about it. There is no majority in the House of Commons for Brexit. They cannot, most of them, other than the Liberal Democrats and the Blairites, they cannot openly state that having held a referendum that the Prime Minister said from the dispatch box would be binding and that the government would implement the decision the people made, then have a multi-million-pound Brexit referendum campaign, then have 17.4 million people vote to leave, and then openly defy it. It's difficult for most MPs to do that. So the next best thing is, of course, Brexit in name only. But actually, Brexit in name only is worse than remaining in the European Union. Because if you really are still in the European Union, but pretending you've Brexited, then you're actually merely a rule taker. You have no seat at the table making the rules that you are nonetheless bound to take. You don't even have the dubious, I'll grant you, pleasure of sending the likes of Nigel Farage to sit in the European Parliament and collect very large amounts of money for so doing. You don't have anyone in the European Parliament. You don't have anyone in the Council of Ministers. You don't have anyone in the Commission. But everything the EU decides, you have to swallow. Well, I'll make no bones about it, and I've said right from the very beginning that the so-called Norway option or the Switzerland option leaves us in a position where it would be better to remain than to pretend to have left, but to continue to take whatever is doled out by the European Union. This from David, not unblemished, but the record of David Davis for civil liberties and against military adventurism means he can never lead the Tory party. Well, that and his support for Brexit. But still, this is his to put up or shut up. And Dan in Chester says, how does an object contaminated with the same Novichok used to poison the Skripals evade the detection of a massive police search, yet to be found just lying around in the park by a couple 4 months later? And why hasn't any mainstream media journalist asked this question? Well, I'm on the mainstream here, Dan, and I ask it every day and all day. David again says the diplomatic editor of BBC Newsnight, Mark Urban, was having meetings with Sergei Skripal only last summer. Keep that in mind and ask yourself why no one ever mentions it. Indeed, David, it's my pinned tweet. I want to know why Mark Urban kept secret from the BBC licence payers all the while he was reporting on the Salisbury affair, that just a few months earlier he had been regularly meeting Sergei Skripal. And I've asked when the BBC knew this and when they're going to explain it. I think these are rather important questions, and the fact that neither the BBC nor Mark Urban have deigned to answer them yet just makes me more suspicious. Patrick says, hi Gigi, surely the most likely cause of the Amesbury poisoning is an infected batch of drugs. Both were into heroin. All this MSM and government talk of Novichok seems wide of the mark and likely propaganda. Should anyone believe anything that Porton Down says? Christina says the Tory government plan maybe is to take the pressure off the Tory government on Brexit and put the pressure on Labour. Tory government maybe have the agenda of passing the buck to Labour, hoping Labour will tear itself to shreds instead of the Tories doing so. Well, it's a good point, Christina, but do the maths. Jeremy Corbyn will vote against the Chequers proposals. He said so. Even Keir Starmer, on his behalf, said so at the weekend. That's why a hand-picked group of Labour MPs are about to meet the Conservative Party's chief whip. Because if you do the maths, if Labour were to vote en masse against the Chequers proposal, then together with the Brexiteer Tory MPs, they would defeat the government and bring it down. So how do you solve that problem? You get enough Labour traitors to desert their own side and their own constituents, to cross the floor, metaphorically speaking, at least for the purposes of the vote. And if you get enough Labour traitors, you can outvote the number of Tory Brexiteers. That's why the Chief Whip is meeting them today. And I want to be blunt. Nick Brown, the Labour Chief Whip, is a friend of mine. He might even be listening. Any Labour MP who meets the Tory Chief Whip this afternoon should be immediately expelled from the Parliamentary Labour Party. This is treason, not just against the referendum result, but it's treason against the Labour Party. What do you have to do nowadays to get expelled from the Labour Party? Oppose an illegal and catastrophic war, maybe? Tottenham says, Galloway on, I'm off. Good riddance, you half-wit. Tony X says, before David Davis was given the poison pill of negotiating Brexit, not for the UK, but for a cloven Tory party. That's wonderful. A cloven, C-L-O-V-E-N, a cloven Tory party. He was riding high in my estimation, as high as a Tory can. Let's hope he can regain his equilibrium. He's not a bad man. We're joined by Sir Vince Cable, Member of Parliament and leader of the Liberal Democrats. Sir Vince, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. I'm on a train, but we may get a slightly bumpy journey. But
well, if Chris Grayling's running it, you'll not be going anywhere fast. But thanks, thanks in any case. But if we lose you, we'll understand why. Do you agree with me that a Brexit in name only is hardly worth the trouble? We'd be as well staying in the European Union if we're going to continue, as the Chequers plan intends, to take the rules of the European Union, because at least then we'd have a seat at the table and we'd have members in the European Parliament.
Well, you're exactly right. And in a strange way, this is where I and my party, who want us to stay in the European Union, and some of the hardline Brexiteers who can't see the point of a Brexit in name only, are actually in exactly the same place. So, yeah, you're right. What is the point of all this upheaval? The country has got enormous problems. You know, low pay and productivity, the problem of aging, many of the things we can't get on and deal with them because we're trapped in this Brexit debate that clearly isn't going anywhere and is a complete mess. And Theresa May's compromise has effectively been torpedoed by David Davis this morning because he, of course, has explained that it's just not workable.
Now, Labour MPs are meeting the Conservative Chief Whip. We don't know how many. Or on what basis they were picked. Will your MPs also coordinate now with Theresa May's Chief Whip?
No. We're not propping up the government, and they're in a terrible state. We don't think it's our job just to keep this wretched government going. It's completely divided, and we need an alternative. We're not looking to collaborate with them to make Brexit happen. We think the only realistic now and sensible and fair option is to go back to the public and say, well, you can press on as we have with a sort of deal, or we opt to stay within the European Union and try and reform it from within and have a people's vote on the subject. We think that's much more realistic than a lot of haggling between parties in Westminster.
Now, you must feel that you're closer to that objective than might have seemed possible in the last 2 years.
Yes, I think so. We've been a minority view, but I think when people can see that the easy options, the so-called soft Brexit options, are gradually falling by the wayside because they're undeliverable politically or they're impractical. The stark choice is in front of us, and either we go for the no deal, which would be massively disruptive and cause enormous threats to enormous numbers of people's jobs and livelihoods, or we stay put and try to reform the European Union within. I think the merits of that are beginning to appeal to growing numbers of people.
Now, I had Peter Oborne on earlier in your stead when we couldn't reach you, and he was making light of my comparison with that dramatic day. I sat there on the benches watching it when the mild-mannered Sir Geoffrey Howe broke Mrs. Thatcher on the wheel of his understated rhetoric, which caused the leadership campaign that caused her defenestration. Peter thinks we're not remotely in that kind of day today. Is that your view too?
I think the situation is actually a lot worse. There was an argument at that point about the technical aspects of economic policy, and I suppose about Mrs. Thatcher's leadership. But now we're talking about the future direction of the country for the next generation. I mean, it's a much bigger issue. Of course, David Davis is a somewhat more mercurial character than
Sir Geoffrey,
the former Chancellor at that time. But no, I think Peter Oborne's been a little bit optimistic. I think this really is very serious, actually.
So the Tory party meets tonight. The talk is that there are more than 40 letters calling for a leadership contest. It may be that they don't reach the 48, but if they do, Theresa May has said that she will fight on, and a majority of one will be sufficient. So it could be that she's in for a fight, that she wins, in which case, to borrow a phrase from the Thatcher era, her position would be unassailable then, wouldn't it?
I think the problem the Conservatives have is that although they're very unhappy with Theresa May, there's nobody obviously better. They can go for somebody on the extremes like Rees-Mogg, which will make a lot of the Brexit hardliners happy, but it will divide their party even more. But there's nobody who is better at sort of uniting them around a set of objectives than Theresa May. I mean, she may have her failings, but she's certainly the best of a bad lot. I'm not quite sure how a leadership challenge helps them in any way whatever.
Jeremy Corbyn, I presume, wants a general election. Do you want one?
Well, if there is one, we're up for it. But I really don't see how that helps anybody, because the Labour Party is just as divided and just as confused on this issue as the government. And Jeremy Corbyn's personal position, seems to be indistinguishable from Theresa May. So if we had a general election, it wouldn't solve any problems. And I think the electorate, they've had several elections now, two general elections and a referendum. In Scotland, they've had two referendums. I think the electorate say, why on earth are you coming back to us again for a general election? I think it would be very unpopular. I don't think it would solve any problems, but it's all that Jeremy Corbyn can now say.
Sir Vince Cable, on a train, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Sir Vince Cable then obviously not calling for a general election. Jeremy Corbyn is calling for a general election. I'm with Jeremy Corbyn on this. Where do you stand? I think Britain is in such a state of chaos that we deserve to choose a new government, a new administration. Where do you stand? 0344 499 1000. Sir Vince wants another people's vote. Although we had a people's vote, the biggest vote ever held in these islands just 2 years ago. Sir Vince wants a people's vote on a new referendum, but doesn't want a people's vote in a new general election. Some might say there's rather a contradiction. at the heart of that line of argument. But I want to hear what you think. 0344 499 1000. You can email me through the website at talkradio.co.uk. You can text me. Text the word talk followed by your message to 87222. That'll cost you 25 pence plus normal sending charges. Or you can tweet me at George Galloway at Talk Radio. We're talking about the dramatic events overnight, midnight, 10 minutes to, when David Davis announced his resignation from the cabinet. He's been on the radio this morning saying how much he likes and admires Theresa May, but not enough to sit in her cabinet. He's been on the radio this morning saying that, of course, she can continue as Prime Minister. That is to say, implementing a policy that he finds so offensive that he's resigned from the cabinet over it. Boris Johnson says Theresa May's policy is a polished turd, but he's prepared to eat turd and remain in the Foreign Office. Michael Gove was on television actually supporting Theresa May's polished turd. Liam Fox has gone missing. It's all very interesting, as are any number of other issues breaking in the news, not the least of which came with the demise of one of the two victims of whatever it was they found in a park in Amesbury, Salisbury in Wiltshire. I'm George Galloway, standing in for Mike Graham. I'm here till 1 o'clock. Now, in the midst of all this tumult on our own domestic political front, Donald Trump is flying in. In fact, a blip, is that what you call them? Blip? No, a blimp is going to be flying over the London skyline, portraying the President of the United States of America in a nappy as a baby. Apparently, there's an alternative blimp for Sadiq Khan, the London mayor, who's made such a phenomenon possible. Sadiq Khan's never been on a demonstration in the 30 years that I have known him. Sadiq Khan never demonstrated against anybody. He never demonstrated against George W. Bush. But boy, does he want a demonstration against Donald Trump. Jan Halper-Hayes is my antithesis. She's the representative of Republican overseas. And a very nice woman, actually. Jan, welcome to the show.
Always pleased to be with you, George.
Thank you, my dear. Now, it must trouble you that so special has the relationship between Britain and the United States president become that the mayor of London is flying an inflatable balloon against your president upon his arrival. How do you feel about that?
Well, you know, the guy that put the thing together, on one hand, I find it hilarious. On another hand, I actually think it's mean-spirited because the intention is to say all of Britain is laughing at him. And I, in general, don't think it's very respectful to anyone in a leadership position. And Sadiq Khan and Donald Trump have been having baby boy spats on Twitter. So it didn't surprise me that Sadiq Khan approved it.
Mind you, Boris Johnson, who's our Foreign Secretary, tweeted not that long ago, but before he became Foreign Secretary, that he wouldn't go to New York City for fear of bumping in to Donald Trump.
Well, you know, people change their minds.
They do indeed, especially in exchange for a ministerial a limousine and a title of Foreign Secretary. Now, people do change their mind, but a lot of people's mind is made up about Donald Trump, both in the United States and in Britain. I'll not myself be on the march against Trump, but I think a very large number of people will. How do you think that'll go down in the United States?
Well, George, the UK fits in to the United States 38.3 times. You're going to have about 15,000 demonstrators. And I can tell you that probably 10, 15 times of that Trump has dealt with across the United States. It's going to be insignificant to him. He's not going to see it. The balloon goes up from 9:30 to 11:30 on Friday morning, and Trump will be at a military facility with the prime minister and then on his way to Chequers.
But the optics of that are not good. By the way, there'll be 10 times that number on the demonstration. There'll be 150,000 plus on the demonstration.
Oh,
I'm sure
really?
about that.
Oh, okay.
But the
All
optics, the optics of that are not good, are they? He's meeting the prime minister at a military facility.
Well, he did say that it was a working trip, and it actually is looking at the UK-US military training because we have exchange programs.
Yes, indeed. Now, where does Trump stand at the minute? He's under investigation. The Mueller investigation goes on and on. They've just hired new prosecutors. The toxic atmosphere between the Democrats and the president, and increasingly a Republican Party that is behind the president, even if they had differences in the past. America looks a very much more polarized place than it used to.
You know, I think that we're more aware of how polarized it is because Donald Trump keeps it in the news every single day. But we've been polarized. This has been in the works for almost 20 years. Once you had the identity politics of the right, the Christian coalition, and then you had it of the left, I think both of our political parties literally need to have a coming to Jesus meeting and get their identities to be more current. Because in the last election, it wasn't identity politics. It was pocketbook voters. They voted for the economy and they voted for national security and immigration. And Trump, with all of you hearing about the 2,200 kids across the border, in the past week, Trump's poll numbers with Hispanics has gone up 10 points.
You see, one of the problems I have interviewing you is that you talk so much sense when the title you bear suggests otherwise. This identity politics, they were called hot button issues at the time, began with the right. They began with the Republicans. This was the Karl Rove monstering of Democrats by pushing hot buttons like abortion, gay marriage, and so on. Since when, the Democrats have become an entirely hot-button identity politics organization, so that people were expected to vote for Hillary Clinton despite the crock that she carried around on her back because she was a woman. And the Democrats, and indeed across the world, many on the so-called left, have become merely a ragbag of identity politics issues, whilst the pocketbook issues, which matter most to those from whom we hear least, are entirely ignored.
Well, I think I'm a bit older than you, so I would go back even farther to say where the right started going very, very right was with Pat Robertson and the Christian Coalition. And that was one time I had a hard time being a Republican. You know, I had to kind of leave the party at that point. But there's always been a fight between pro-choice and pro-life. They call it killing if you have an abortion, and the Democrats call it the anti-life people instead of, the pro-life people. But at this point, we really have to think about what has improved in our country. Why are the Democrats fighting for the illegals, fighting for lawlessness? Because they don't seem to have some concrete values that appeal to people. And instead, they've got this moral superiority attitude judging us. And, it's getting old. Just tell us how it should be different. We're open.
Well, it wasn't different under them. It wasn't different. Barack Obama separated children from parents exactly as Trump is doing. Barack Obama deported more people from the United States than Trump is doing. Bill Clinton put more black people in jail than any president in the whole history of the country.
Yes. And Barack Obama used drones to kill more people than all of our presidents combined. I'm pretty impressed, George, that you were up to date on all those other things. Bravo.
See, you and I are both experts in our field. Jan, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. The irony is my producers always book you in the hope that you and I will have a punch-up on air, and it just never happens. We're both too polite for that.
Oh, well, you know what? It's so lovely to talk to you because you're so intelligent and you know things, so that it makes me feel good because to your listeners, we actually are giving them some information so they can make their own decisions.
Well, we're both married, Jan, so we should leave it at that. Jan Halper Hayes of the Republicans Overseas, 0344 499 1000.
Great guy, folks.
Well, that's Donald Trump. I don't know when he came in to record that jingle, but do we still call them jingles? Is that very 1970s? Donald Trump thinks I'm not a good guy, folks. Most people in Britain think he's not a good guy, folks. And many of them, Jan Halper Hayes thought 15,000. There will be at least 10 times that number. And maybe many, many more than that. 0344 499 1000. What do you think about Donald Trump's upcoming visit to Britain? What do you think about the Brexit imbroglio, David Davis's resignation, and the shock news that an undeterminate number of Labour MPs are about to metaphorically cross the floor and go to a meeting called by the Conservative Chief Whip, so that Theresa May's Chequers proposals, which murder Brexit, can actually pass through the House. I used to have a column in Westminster, and I recommend, if they've kept them in the archive, looking back at them. I predicted over many, many columns, over many, many weeks, that what is now happening would happen. It's just as well I don't do the National Lottery. Let's go over, if we can, to the talk radio reporter Alex Dibble, who's on College Green. Alex, are you there?
I am indeed, George. It's a remarkable atmosphere down here as politicians and others just try to react to what has sent shockwaves, really, through Parliament, hasn't it? I mean, we weren't really expecting this. We knew David Davis wasn't particularly happy, but was he so unhappy that he was going to resign? Not that many people thought he would. And so people wake up on a Monday morning to the incredible news that the Brexit Secretary is gone. And consider the timing of this, George. The next round of negotiations with the EU begin next week. And it's only 9 months until the UK is meant to be leaving the European Union. So, I mean, remarkable stuff.
It is. It's a strange... just before you tell us about who you've been speaking to, let me ask you this. It is a remarkable resignation when the man who's resigning says he continues to support the Prime Minister whose cabinet he's departing. I mean, talk about being prepared to wound, but not to kill.
Yeah, I mean, David Davis was on Talk Radio Breakfast, as listeners will probably be aware this morning, and his argument on that point was that he agrees with the Prime Minister that we have to try and deliver the best Brexit for the country, but he just disagrees that this is the best way to do it, the way that Theresa May is pursuing at the moment. So that would be his response to that. You know, I support her to get the best Brexit. I can't support this particular version of it. But I mean, I think people will think back. You know, 2 years ago we had the referendum, and David Cameron was forced to resign, wasn't he, because he had obviously supported Remain. And then in the aftermath, there was all these questions, well, who's going to replace him then? And should it be a Brexiteer who can then lead as a Prime Minister Britain through Brexit. And then in the end, Theresa May sort of emerged, even though she was a Remainer, because it was sort of felt that she could unite both sides of the Conservative Party, the Brexiteers, the Remainers, because she hadn't been that prominent in the EU campaign on either side. She'd voted Remain, but she hadn't really been involved. So people thought, yeah, she's a good option. But 18 months later, people might be regretting for generations putting a Remainer as the Prime Minister of this country in the Conservative Party.
Indeed.
Because let's be honest, if it was a Brexiteer, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
No, I mean, she supports Brexit as the rope supports the hanging man. Her purpose has been to render it entirely non-operative, and that's where it currently stands.
Labour and others will say, hey, look, you can put a brave face on this, but there are issues like, for example, the Irish border, where, we still do not know what on earth is happening, and those things, you can't just sweep them under the carpet.
Alex, you said you'd spoken to Chuka Umunna. I spoke to Vince Cable earlier. Both of them want a people's vote, even though we had one 2 years ago. But neither of them means a general election vote. Neither of them want to bring the government down. Did Chuka say that he'd be going to the meeting of Labour apostates with the Conservative government's chief whip this afternoon?
He didn't. He was keeping his cards relatively close to his chest. But it is a remarkable development, isn't it, for something like this to happen, for Labour MPs to be, as you said a few moments ago, sort of crossing the floor to be meeting with the Conservative chief whip. I mean, these are highly unusual events, and because we are in a highly unusual situation, so we wait with sort of eager expectation to find out what happens from that particular meeting. And also, I said to Chuka, look, you can criticise the government all you want, but let's face it, if Labour were in charge at the moment, you'd be having the same issues, because there are huge splits within Labour about Brexit as well. So, this is not an easy thing for anyone to deal with. The question is whether the UK as a country can pick themselves up from this rather shock resignation and keep going.
Alex, you're doing a great job. We'll come back to you if we can later in the show. That's Alex Dibble on College Green outside the British Parliament, where remarkable scenes are unfolding. Mark Challoner says, you trying to depress the whole country, George. Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister doesn't bear thinking about. Just a tip, Mark, it's B-E-A-R, not B-A-R-E. And Andrew says, Dear George, good morning. Another hot day. What we need is a load of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to protect us from the ravages of the sun. Whoops. And Fra says, talk radio on fire, George, from the Orange Order sectarianism to Conservative Party schisms and Brexit confoundism. It must be the mother of all talk shows. And on a Monday, too. Thanks, Fra. Yes, for one day only, I'm in for the great Mike Graham. JPT says, how is the Amesbury death of Dawn Sturgis murder? Surely murder has to be deliberate. Well, that's actually a fair point. It would not be murder, it would be manslaughter. Nat Kimber says, do you think there will be another election? And do you think Theresa will leave? Also love listening to you. Thanks, Nat. Well, there will be no general election if people like Chuka Umunna and Jess Phillips have their way, even though millions, tens of millions perhaps, in the country are aching for a general election, a real people's vote. The Labour traitors may well save the government from defeat, because it's already clear a significant number of Tory MPs will not vote for the Chequers proposals. And if the official Labour line is, as it was expressed on Sunday, that they too will vote against the Chequers proposals, do the maths. You need enough Labour traitors to cross the floor to make up for the Tory Brexit rebels. And that's the only way that Theresa May could possibly survive. And will there be enough of them? Mr. Lexit says, Theresa May is a Remainer at heart. I'm not surprised at what happened after Chequers. And Darren says, May is inviting some Labour MPs to number 10 today. Is it the Blairites to help her stop Corbyn? The Blairites and May need to go now. Jeremy should pick Frank Field or Kate Hoy to be Labour's Brexit Secretary. And Julie J. says, people keep saying how little time we have left in the Brexit negotiations, but I haven't heard anyone mention the summer recess. Unless they work through it, the time we have left is far smaller than it appears. Great to hear you on the air in a morning, Gigi. Thank you, Julie. There's nothing to negotiate now. That's the point that's being missed. Of course the EU will accept Theresa May's Chequers proposal, because Theresa May's Chequers proposal mean that we're not leaving the European Union after all. Nothing to negotiate. Let's talk to Steve Hawkes, Deputy Political Editor of The Sun. Steve, welcome back.
How are you, George?
I'm good, thanks. It's a remarkable...
Quite quiet, isn't it?
It's a remarkable day for the silly season. Look, this might seem counterintuitive to you, but I'm beginning to think in the course of the last hour and a half that the big story today is the Labour MPs that are going to meet the Tory Chief Whip this afternoon. What do you think of that?
No, completely true. I mean, this story cuts into so many different elements, and it's developing by the hour, by the minute. I mean, the appointment of Dominic Raab as is a big move, and such as Michael Gove sort of follow a disciple and a big Brexiteer. So that's that one, call it off. But then it now comes down, as you say, to Labour. If, as we believe, this hardcore of Brexiteers on the Tory benches aren't going to back Theresa May's Brexit, well, what do Labour do? Where are the numbers? Mm-hmm. And so there's a core now in the Labour Party who have got a huge responsibility. You're speaking to Labour leavers this morning. They actually feel as though Theresa May's sort of checkers fudge as you were is okay. They would back it. People like John Mann, Frank Field seem to be willing to give her the benefit of the doubt. But it's that hardcore now, as well as the Corbynites. You've got the sort of EEA brigade. What do?
Well, that's right. But if there's let's talk. Pick numbers out of a hat. Say there's 50 Tory MPs that will not back the Chequers fudge. That needs, therefore, if the official opposition line is, as Keir Starmer said it was on Sunday, that Labour will vote against the Chequers proposals, that needs at least 50 then Labour rebels to back the Tories in order to cancel out the Tory rebels. Now, people like Choka Amona and so on are talking about the need for a people's vote, ignoring the fact there actually was a people's vote 2 years ago, and ignoring the fact, as Vince Cable did on this very show, that he doesn't want a general election. He doesn't want an actual people's vote. He just wants to kill off Brexit. Fascinating maths, even.
Yeah, but I think even before any vote on the deal, you got this vote on the customs union in 2 weeks' time, which is going to be quite pivotal now, because how many people there? The whole Chequers deal was sold to the Brexit cabinet minister, saying, look, we have to accept this, or Parliament will force us into a customs union in 2 weeks when this legislation is put before the House. So again, that's the next big showdown, and how Labour MPs vote on that one. I mean, you'd think after this cabinet decision, on Friday you thought, okay, they've agreed this collective line. When it comes to the customs vote, the government will win that, and they'll continue winning now through to the summer. But now, what do the Tory, the Brexiteers do? They'll probably vote against the government on this because they're furious. But the risk is that then you end up in a situation where there is no deal because no one's agreeing anything. And then we really are into worrying territory, because we'll career towards this deadline of next March with nothing. Because Chuka and his guys will want to stay, as you say, overturn Brexit as such and just stay in the EU. And then you've got the SNP who will just play their cards because they want, a Scottish angle on all this. And it's a real mess.
It is, and to think that she unnecessarily went to the country so she could have a strong and stable administration, you really couldn't make it up. But
no,
Steve,
that wasn't one of the most sensible decisions.
No, definitely not. Steve, the Tory party meeting this evening. What are you hearing about that? I mean, I'm looking at the screens. I see the usual Tory Brexit suspects up there. Is there a substantial revolt for real Brexit in the Tory party?
I don't think people keep talking about these 48 letters, i.e. the threshold they need to get to trigger a confidence vote in the Prime Minister. I don't think they're at 48 yet. I mean, that could be famous last words, but you're speaking to a few of the more moderate, quieter Tory MPs. They don't think there's enough to reach the 48 at the moment. And I imagine that the Prime Minister will go in there, and people like Michael Gove will play a central role in this and say, look, you do not know what you're about to do. If you trigger a confidence vote, we are perilously close, therefore, to Labour moving in. And to having this call for a general election, the momentum behind that. And so that will be their message, I think, like it was on Friday. Say, look, you might not like this, but this is what the public voted for. They voted for Brexit. And also, if you challenge the Prime Minister now, if you dethrone her, who's going to take her job? Who's going to go in her place? And what does that mean about the Tories' hold on power as well? And I think that's what they'll say. And, on Friday, a lot of the Tory MPs were saying, well, we're not going to act now. We're going to see if a minister resigns or not. That minister is now resigning, David Davis, and Steve Baker as well. I don't think we'll get to 48. And Downing Street will be desperately hoping that Theresa May plays a blinder this afternoon and manages to win some of these waving people over. But it's all to play for. I think more important is the mood in the chamber, where Theresa May goes into Parliament, into Commons at 3:30. Who speaks up on her behalf in that chamber?
She doesn't play many blinders, Steve.
Well, the one place she does play a blinder is in the Commons. I mean, she's done it before on big occasions, say at the Hillsborough statement in the House of Commons, where there's a generally accepted she did very, very well. And in that stage is the one where she does shine. It's the only one, really, that she does shine, is in the Commons. But more importantly, as well as what she says, will be the people who stand up and speak. Does Gove stand up and speak? I'm pretty sure he will, in full support of her. Does David Davis stand up and do a Geoffrey Howe?
Well, I don't think he will. Look, I mean, I was there when Geoffrey Howe did the Geoffrey Howe. And I'll tell you, for high drama to come from, it was the mouse that roared. And I watched literally Thatcher folding up, breaking, as she sat there at the dispatch box and as his blows went in. But the rebels had a leader then.
I don't think we're there. I don't think we're there yet.
No, I don't either.
Jacob Rees-Mogg, he didn't say that he would vote her down today. He said he could see a situation where Theresa May is still in place in March. So, and that, he has an almighty degree of power. You've got the younger, Bernard Jenkins was talking about it earlier on to one of the old guard, but then you've got the new guard, Andrew Jenkins, Marcus Fish. Marcus Fish this morning is another hardcore ERG Brexiteer. Even he wasn't saying that it was time for her to go as yet. So I don't think we're there yet. But they have a huge amount of work behind the scenes, the whips and number 10, to try and win people back. You could argue that DD was looking for a way out, and with rumours of him wanting to resign for a long time now. At last Tory conference, he was having a drink with some people, after the day, and was saying, well, I'll probably step down in March 2019 anyway. And then, they had to douse out that story. He's been looking at stepping down for quite some time now. So you think they could contain this, but they've got an awful lot of work to do.
Heseltine was a leader in waiting. They don't have a leader in waiting in the Tory party. And as Peter Oborne put it on this show earlier, Theresa May has effectively vaporised Boris Johnson and Michael Gove and whoever that fellow that used to be called Liam Fox now is. And Davis himself on the radio this morning saying that he was quitting but continuing to support the person whose cabinet he was quitting. So it's a row of polished turds, if you ask me.
I think the one name you mentioned, I think Boris has vaporised himself, but I think Gove has emerged from this. You remember he was sacked by, when Theresa May rode in like Bodas here after that leadership contest, and then, all-powerful Theresa, and then, Gove was sacked. And now he's back, and he is such a pivotal figure. People were briefing that when it came to Chequers on Friday, he was magisterial in the way he summed up and said to everyone, look, we now need to back this. And people say that within DEFRA, he's realised that actually Brexit isn't as easy as that people like himself and Vote Leave thought. There's a huge amount, not just in agriculture, but also in chemicals, which he has responsibility for. And so he is a key figure now. If Michael said, no, this is unsustainable, I can't back this, I think the government would fall. It's that much. He's that powerful.
Very interesting. I knew him when he was a striker, sitting on the picket line outside the Aberdeen Press and Journal. Who'd have thunk he'd turn out to be so pivotal? He was on strike for a whole year, by the way. He's the longest striker in the House of Commons. Yeah, he was a member of the NUJ and a daily picket line attender. And that's when I first knew him. Well, actually, I knew him at university when I spoke at the Oxford Union when he was the president. But that's...
So what do you think, George? George, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, of course.
What do you think Jeremy does now? Jeremy Corbyn, what does he do?
Well, I think he's played a blinder by doing nothing. I was once in the Forbidden City in Beijing, and there was the slogan of one of the main emperors, I forget his name, but the English translation of his motto was "do nothing," and that's what Corbyn has done. And Brexit has caused so much trouble inside the Conservative Party. That line has been borne out. And as Napoleon said, never interrupt your enemy when he's busy making a mistake.
But the key thing is, I think that, so last week we are seeing that the Tories have had to kick the can down the road for so long, and now we're seeing, as soon as they make a decision, the civil war that has been brewing has now erupted. Yeah. But that same thing surely is going to happen with Labour at some point. Because Jeremy's going to have to say at some time or another.
I agree. Well, that's why I was surprised to hear Starmer say yesterday that Labour definitively would vote against the Chequers proposals. And that's the right line. But a very large number of Labour MPs, and we'll see how many this afternoon maybe, a very large number of Labour MPs will not follow that line, even if it's a three-line whip.
That's always been the case. I think where Keir publicly announces a policy, hoping that then he can get Jeremy and, more importantly, Seamus to agree with it.
Well, I couldn't possibly comment on that latter point. Steve Hawkes, Deputy Political Editor of The Sun. Always a pleasure, Steve, especially when you make predictions, because then I can hold you to account when these predictions go wrong, though I suspect you're right on this occasion. Marcus says on the Twitter, Theresa May has played her fellow politicians, but she's not outplayed the people. The anger bubbling in the country is palpable. Watch this space. There will be hell to pay. Do you know what, Marcus? I think you're right about that. Let's hear from Eileen in Exmouth. Go ahead, Eileen.
Oh, hello, George.
Hi.
Nice to talk to you.
And to you.
Eileen from Sydenham.
Very nice to hear from you. Go ahead.
Now, I was intrigued by, oh, God, I've forgotten his name now. Vince Cable.
Sir Vince, if you don't mind. Yes.
Well, he said a very interesting thing, and I think I heard this correctly. He said, we don't need a general election because it wouldn't solve any of our problems.
Yeah.
Did he say that?
He did. He's the last man in the country that wants a general election, is Sir Vince, because the Liberals would get filleted and he'd be out of a job.
So in that case, he's not interested at all in the state of the country. He's only interested in his own ends, because, for instance, he must know that if there was a general election and we did manage to vote a Corbyn government in, the whole landscape would change entirely. Surely he must know that. So therefore, I cannot believe all these people are so self-interested.
Chuka Umunna and Jess Phillips don't want a general election either.
Well,
Jess Phillips has said that repeatedly. She
Yeah,
said repeatedly she doesn't want a general election.
Yeah, but those people, why can't we get them out of the party? It's absolute madness.
Well, I've been clear on this, Eileen. Those that go to the meeting with the Tory chief whip this afternoon, should every one of them be immediately kicked out of the Parliamentary Labour Party. Because this is open collaboration with their enemy.
Yes. Now, I don't know if we'll ever get to the bottom of why Jeremy and his team are not going to do that. We presume they're not going to do that. But what I did want to say to you, George, was that I work very hard for the Labour Party as one of the Labour Party members. And I have been getting really quite at the end of my tether, really. And I often think to myself, well, how does Jeremy keep going? And that's the only thing that keeps me at it, because he just never gives up. Neither do you. And I'm just in awe of you. I don't know how you don't just get despairing of the whole thing.
No, I mean, you've got to keep going, because to abandon now this lifelong struggle would be to invalidate the whole of your life. It would be to say that you have wasted the whole of your life. So, you know, it's not that Jeremy's a superhero or anything. It's just that he truly believes in what he stands for, and he's spent an entire lifetime fighting for it, and he's not going to give up now. And he could be, if he had a united Labour Party behind him on the benches and in the headquarters, by the way, he could be within touching distance of winning a general election and becoming Prime Minister. That's quite a prize, Eileen.
It is, and also, yes, I get you there. Now, I did talk to Jeremy at the NHS March last week, and I was just a member of the crowd, and the time he gives to people, the time he gives to people who are nobody, just people from the crowd. He talked to me. I said to him I was concerned that we were all just going to go home now and we should all just stay. But I found out since that, you can't stay. The police would move us on if we just stayed until, the government came to listen to us, as it were. But he looked at me and he listened to me. And do you know what he did? He looked at me and he squeezed my hand. And I thought, what a great guy. He just squeezed my hand as if to say, I understand how you feel. And almost as if it will be okay. Do you get it?
Yeah, well, let's hope he's right. Eileen, thanks for that in Exmouth. Tony is in Liverpool. Tony, welcome.
Good morning to you, George.
Good morning.
Thanks very much for taking the call.
Welcome.
I agree with you. I think the big story today is the collusion between the Remainers and both parties. I think this was orchestrated way back at the beginning when Andrea Leadsom was very popular with the Tory base, but obviously the Tories parachuted a Remainer in Theresa May, who's a technocrat rather than an ideologue, I would say.
Yeah.
I think essentially we're looking at very unhappy people in the north and the Midlands, Labour voters, voters of all parties, shall I say. 400 out of 650 constituencies voted to leave. 66%-ish Labour constituencies voted to leave. And yet we are now looking at collusion with both parties. Now, the point I'd like to make, George, is I think there's a space now. We need an umbrella party. We need a party made up of leavers from all the parties collaborating together to drive this through, because it's clear that we're hitting roadblocks here, and these are not roadblocks that were unforeseen. They've been building these roadblocks. Let's cut to the chase. Roadblocks are intendedly being put in the way of Brexit. It's clear. It's a globalist elite which has obviously got its hooks into the politics of this country, both in the House of Lords and the House of Commons, especially in the House of Lords. For me, they're rotten to the core, the whole lot of them. Absolutely, they are appalling. I wouldn't vote for either party unless we have one of them that's going to say, right, we are going to deliver Brexit as you voted it.
Well, look, that's a clever call, Tony, and I agree with, I think, all of it. And it might happen. Farage might come back. He might change the name of UKIP to the Brexit Party. And he might do well if he did. He might be able to bring people who wouldn't touch UKIP with a barge pole, especially UKIP post the last general election, which has basically turned into the political wing of the English Defence League. There's no future in that. But if Farage became the leader of the Brexit Party, I think that party might do very well indeed. But let me put an alternative to you, and I think that this is what will happen. Jeremy Corbyn will vote against the Chequers proposals, and that will be the official Labour Party line. But enough Labour MPs will betray the Labour Party, vote with the Tories, and keep Theresa May in power. That's what I think is going to happen. Tony, I hope I see you at the St George's Hall on the 8th of September. Tickets are going like hotcakes, so get yours quick. That was Tony in Liverpool. And we've still got an hour to go, in which we're going to discuss, amongst other things, the extraordinary events in Glasgow yesterday, which were heralded by an Irish woman who thinks she's British, who came to Cowdenbeath to lead a march celebrating the victory of a 17th century Dutch king fighting under the papal standard, who defeated a Scottish leader at the Battle of the Boyne. Confused? You might be, but I'm going to clarify it all in the next hour when we discuss the Orange Walkers in Scotland. Now, Dr. Michelle Carlin is a senior lecturer in forensic and analytical chemistry. She has an MSc in forensic science, and she's senior lecturer at Northumbria University. Because I wanted to talk about the dark turn that the Amesbury story took late last night with the demise of the first victim of what the media keep calling Novichok. Dr. Carlin, thanks for joining us.
Good afternoon.
The immune system of drug users, as both the victims in Amesbury were, is obviously not at the best. But given the allegation is that the product that is attacking these people is a military-grade nerve agent, it won't have come as a surprise to you, of all people, that it's claimed its first victim.
Well, we know obviously that the nerve agents work in a very particular way in the body and they cause damage. If somebody has had, for example, a problem with alcoholism or drugs, then it can affect a variety of organs in the body. And one of those that could be affected is the liver. And the liver is the organ in our body that helps process toxins from our body. So if somebody's liver isn't functioning as a healthy liver would, then it could have an effect on an outcome of a poisoning case.
Now, let me ask you about this substance. It is the government's case that it's Novichok, or from the family of Novichok agents, and moreover that it came from Russia. I'm not going to ask you anything about the latter point. It's a political one. But the product itself, it was said by one of its principal inventors, a Russian scientist who now lives in the United States, that it's highly vulnerable to water, and we know that. That's why there's been a lot of hosing down and talk of baby wipes, and sunlight. Both of which there has been plenty in the park where it is said that these two Amesbury victims found something, some kind of receptacle that contained the residue of the material used to attack the Skripals. Do you concur with that a lot of rain, a lot of sunshine would ordinarily have been thought to wipe this product out?
Well, with the information that's been available, we don't know if it's been stored inside a container.
Yeah.
If the agent, like in the case with the Skripals where the bench was contaminated, the bench was removed. For the cleanup, it was on tables and door handles. And so access to water in the environment would have removed it. And obviously the excess water that was used in the decontamination greatly affected that. And obviously it was successful in the cleanup. Otherwise, we wouldn't have heard nothing in the interim.
Yeah.
With this case, then we don't know what the item was. We don't know if the agent was inside or on the surface. Mm-hmm. So if it was on the surface, yes, you would expect that it would have been interacting with the environment. But if it's inside, then that's a completely different story.
Yeah. And neither do we know where this receptacle is. It's been variously described as a syringe, as a vial, as a tub, and even absurdly as cigarette butts, which of course begs the question, where is the dead smoker of the original cigarette? So there are a lot of unknowns and even unknown unknowns in this picture. But if the assailant of the Skripals attacked them on the doorknob of their house, why would there be residue on the park bench? And if there was residue on the park bench, why wouldn't it be in the restaurant where they'd spent a couple of hours, which is still trading normally? That all leads me to think that they were attacked on the park bench.
But they did find some traces in the restaurant. The thing is, if somebody has touched something, now they haven't said for sure that it was from the door handle, because if you think about it, if you were leaving the house with your partner or your daughter or your son, both of you do not check the door at the same time.
No.
So you're not both going to touch the door. And so even if you have touched it, both of you, then you're going to have it on the surface of your hands. Mm-hmm. And it's like anything. If you think about germs as well, if you don't wash your hands properly, you're going to transfer trace levels of germs as you touch things. And the same would be true of this agent. If it was on their hands or it was on their clothing, everything that they touch would have some level of contamination. But obviously, the more that they touch things, the less they will put onto that surface because they'll have lost it along the way, which is why by the time they were in the restaurant, there could have been very little that was left.
Yeah, except this receptacle seems, again, we're dealing in the realms of speculation, seems to have been found quite near the park bench. So why it would be near the park bench when it was used on the doorknob quite some distance away and some 5 hours earlier is still a mystery to me.
Well, obviously, everybody is only going on what information has been available for the media. Yeah. So it would be just speculation to say there are many reasons why it could be there. It may have been thrown, discarded. You don't know what's happened. We still don't know who is responsible for it. And so we don't know what path they've taken when they're either, if it is from the original source, if they were trying to dispose of it, or if it's from a separate incident altogether.
Dr. Carlin, thank you very much for joining us. Dr. Michelle Carlin from the University of Northumbria, where she's the senior lecturer in forensic and analytical chemistry. I need to press on quickly because there's so much still to deal with. Senior skeptic says, if you ask me, Dominic Raab is the next leader of the Conservatives. And Andy H. says, regarding the Novichok debacle, on Sky News on Friday, a Mr. Tim Trevan, an ex-UN weapons inspector, stated that the Czechs, Iran, US and the UK had all produced Novichok in trial quantities, thereby contradicting the government's main argument against Russia. The interviewer then calmly changed the subject. What has happened to journalism in this country? It's alive and well here, Andy, I can tell you. David says, Dominic Raab used to be Chief of Staff to David Davis, but at the last general election, he did not know what the national debt was. Theresa May is now having to give jobs to anything with a pulse. Hassan says, good sign, Raab can deal with detail, as this is where the devil lies, no? There's no detail left of any importance. Here's Damien, the legend, in Brighton. Damien, go ahead, sir.
Good afternoon, George.
Afternoon.
George, I'd like to discuss Theresa May's position. But firstly, I'd just quickly like to say that I completely agree with your comments about the Labour MPs who are planning on meeting with the Tory chief whip today.
In my opinion, that's an exit ticket. That should be them on their way out of the Labour Party. They're meeting the Tory chief whip to save the Tory government from collapse.
Precisely, George. I mean, in my view, meeting the Tory chief whip to conspire with the Tories to save May, prevent a general election and prevent a Labour government being returned it clearly warrants immediate and automatic expulsion from the Labour Party. And I trust Nick Brown will make that point explicitly clear to them. And following their expulsions, the Labour Party would be wise to very publicly announce that those MPs have been expelled from the Labour Party for attempting to block Brexit.
Yeah, to block Brexit and block a general election.
Exactly. It's absolutely disgusting, and those people are not fit to be Labour MPs. So, George, on the Theresa May's position, I'll rattle through, bit to cover, but I'll do my best to get through it as pithily as I can. Now, as I see it, George, there are two fundamentals of Brexit that remain the same. The first we've discussed before, which is 65% of constituencies voted leave. That represents an overwhelming mandate, and any party which seeks to frustrate or block that mandate will be annihilated at the next general election. The second fundamental is that any MP who doesn't understand leaving the EU means leaving the customs union, leaving the single market, and ending freedom of movement, self-evidently doesn't have the reasoning faculties to sit in the House of Commons.
Well, that's right, yeah.
Now, I was looking at the resignation letter from David Davis, the former Brexit Secretary, and the comments he's made in that are fatally wounding, I believe, to Theresa May's premiership, George.
Except he doesn't want to bring her down.
Well, yeah, the public support is one thing, but in his letter, George, he describes May's proposal, I quote, as a progressive dilution of the Conservatives' manifesto promise to leave the single market and the customs union. And he also says that the inevitable consequence of her proposal will mean that leaving the EU is an illusion. Now, the question that this all leads to, George, and I'm not sure whether I can answer it or you can answer it because we're Labour people. I think that only a Conservative can answer this question, and that is, are the Tories going to allow May to betray 17.4 million voters? Is there not a single deckhand on board who's going to prize May's deathly grip from the ship's wheel to stop her driving the Tory party into the rocks and dragging it down to Davy Jones' locker? And I think that is a question that only the Conservatives can answer. George, what do you think?
Well, I think it's a brilliantly posed question, and I love the nautical metaphor. I may return to it, but perhaps that's not my place. Now, as Donald Rumsfeld said, there are known knowns, there are known unknowns, and there are also unknown unknowns. A lot of people ridiculed him for saying that, but as a matter of fact, as a matter of simple logic, it's accurate. And there's no set of unknown unknowns like what's going on in Wiltshire. Words I never thought I'd say. Just 5 minutes from Britain's own chemical and biological warfare centre at Porton Down, we now have a dead victim, Dawn Sturgis, with another victim clinging to life in intensive care, and just 7 minutes or 8 minutes further on, we have the Skripals. Although we don't know where they are, we just know that they survived an attack by what the government says is Novichok, a military-grade nerve agent. We've all got our different points of view. Mine are different, indeed, from my next guest. But he's definitely worth hearing. He's Mike Yardley, a military historian and a former military man. Mike, welcome to the show.
Hi, George. How are you?
I'm good and better for talking to you. What do you think's going on?
I think we're not being told the whole story. I mean, you and I probably have different opinions on this. I certainly think that on the balance of probabilities, the Russian intelligence services were involved in the Skripals' attempted assassination, and that they have been responsible for a number of other very strange incidents that we can catalogue over recent years, going back as far as Georgy Markov, Litvinenko, and then perhaps a dozen or more in the last couple of years. But I don't think our government is telling us the full story about what is going on. I think that one possibility might be that someone's assassination team was in that area of Amesbury. It is interesting that there is a suggestion that the people who fell victims tragically to this might have been drug users and injecting drug users. It is possible that somebody dumped a syringe somewhere. An assassin dumped a syringe, and that it could have been picked up by these poor people. But it is an extraordinary situation, and of course the diplomatic ramifications are huge. So it is a most intriguing situation and a very tragic one, and I think it's easy to forget that. And I think the other thing that it's easy to forget is that these agents are terrifying substances. I mean, I can remember my training in the army when we'd have what we called NBC training, nuclear, biological and chemical warfare training, where you would have to inject yourself in the thigh if you were ever exposed in a war to any of these chemical agents, these nerve agents. They are terrible things. And what worries me is that our intelligence services apparently have not yet tracked down the source, the container. There could be somewhere in the UK or elsewhere enough of this stuff to kill hundreds or thousands or indeed tens of thousands of people. They are unbelievably toxic. They may break down with exposure to light, etc., or weather or whatever, but this is an amazingly dangerous situation. It's of extreme concern, and hence, of course, we've seen all the resources deployed to try and make sure that everything is, in inverted commas, clean. But we haven't heard the end of this story yet, and I'm sure a lot more facts are yet to come out.
Yeah, there are a number of gigantic contradictions, though, in what we're told we know. These terrifying agents that you have just described very vividly didn't kill the Skripals. Both of them are alive, and one of them, at least, we've seen is well. So not so terrifying after all. Secondly, they were attacked, we're told, from the doorknob of their home. But they slumped on a park bench 5 hours later. And near that park bench, it's said, these two people picked up something, a syringe, a vial, a tub. Some idiots even say cigarette stubs. And that's what infected them, which, if true, means people put Novichok on a doorknob miles away, but went to the very park where the couple, the Skripals, were found in order to throw it away. And throwing it away doesn't sound a very efficient way of dealing with an agent so terrifying and expensive as the one you describe.
Yes, I agree. I agree with part of that, George. Let me first just take you up on the first point, though. These agents are terrifying. I mean, I'm glad I was never in a conflict where I needed to inject myself in the thigh with atropine as an antidote to a nerve agent. But let there be no mistake, the effects of this stuff is like something out of a zombie movie. It is absolutely terrifying. And the idea that some of that stuff is out there still, well, that is terrifying.
Sure it is, yeah.
Your analysis of the evidence there, yes, some of it, there are clearly gaps in what we know. It does seem that these people who were infected recently were, they weren't professional spies. They were just ordinary people who happened, sadly, to come across this stuff. And the most likely explanation is that it had been dumped wherever they found it. That is the most likely explanation. I'm not saying that's a fact. I'm just saying on the balance of probabilities, that is the most likely explanation. You would think, however, under the circumstances, dealing with something of this toxicity, as you point out, that better arrangements would have been made by the assassination team, if that's what it was, for its disposal. So that is another matter. Another interesting point is the guy who was instrumental in developing Novichok had an accident shortly after he came out with the statement after the Salisbury attack, saying that he thought that the Russian government was behind it, and he had an accident when he was waiting at a bus stop or trying to cross the road, as I remember. I mean, that seems to me an extraordinary coincidence, as indeed we must be realistic. Now, I know, again, we differ in our opinions, but there have been an extraordinary number of odd deaths amongst enemies or people who oppose the Kremlin line in the last couple of years. And it is also a fact that it is now legal, as far as the Russian state is concerned, for its intelligence agents to have a license to kill abroad under certain circumstances.
Well, James Bond had a license to kill, for goodness sake, Mike.
And
I mean, there's nothing surprising about
George,
intelligence agencies having a license to kill.
And I take your point, and it is a fair point, because when we look at this as a war or as a battle or whatever way you want to look at it, certainly when we look at it strategically, we are trying to do stuff to the Russians all the time. We have tried to destabilize their state. We have all these sanctions that we've placed upon them, and it would be naive to assume that they are not going to react to those. And particularly in a country where Mother Russia is extremely important as part of the sort of national psyche, you can imagine, I can certainly easily imagine, that you could see a meeting in the Kremlin or inside an intelligence service where somebody's saying, well, look, we're going to take a new hard line. We're going to go back to the old ways. We're going to go back to the idea of SMERSH and we're going to track down traitors and deal with them. I can imagine people having that conversation, and I can imagine why they would do it. I can see the motivation and their justification for it. So I put all of that into the equation. Meantime, though, we have people in provincial Britain dying in the most extraordinary, or one person dying in the most extraordinary manner, two people becoming ill under extraordinary circumstances, and this awful possibility that this agent is still out there.
Yeah, I mean, where is the tub, the vial, the syringe? I just don't understand why it's so difficult to find that. If the thesis is that they found something in the bushes and then foolishly used it, and in one case then killed themselves, where did they do that? Did they do it at home, in which case we've got the receptacle? Did they do it in the park and then re-dump the receptacle? That doesn't sound plausible to me, Mike.
Well, I don't think, nor to me necessarily. There's something else I find very interesting, and I'm very interested in your take on this, George. I noticed on the internet, you and I both are active on the internet. Mm-hmm. I noticed that after the Salisbury attack, I mean, you were one who did not jump to conclusions as to who was responsible. Mm-hmm. But what I found very interesting was that the far right in the UK seemed in many cases to be accepting the Kremlin line on who was responsible. Now, this struck me as something interesting and new. And I think that what the far right perhaps has in common with the modern Kremlin is nationalism, extreme nationalism. And I thought that was an extremely intriguing byproduct of this affair, that you should suddenly see people on the extreme right saying, yes, this was a false flag operation by the CIA, by UK intelligence, by whoever. And I wanted to know why they were saying that. Now, you might say because it's true. I might say because their buttons were being pressed by various media agencies and by all sorts of bots that were encouraging them to say this, because they were trying to deliberately, someone strategically, it might not necessarily be the Russians, but someone strategically was trying to muddy the waters.
Well, unfortunately, we don't have time to debate that at the length that I'd like to. And I don't know who the right-wing people are that took the same view as me, but I grant you this. Political lines are being redrawn. The political boundaries that you and I have known all of our lives have become very, very fluid indeed. And Brexit is one of the issues, as well as Russia and Trump and many other things. These are breaking down boundaries that we thought were set in stone generations ago. Mike Yardley, military historian, thanks for joining us. Not that you'd know it, but in this country, a priest was attacked and spat upon outside a Catholic church in Glasgow by an official legal orange walk. As I said earlier, a mad woman wandered over from Ireland thinking she was British and kicked off the marching season in Cowdenbeath in Fife. She was at the head of an orange walk which celebrates the victory of a Dutch king in the 17th century whose battle forces were led, or rather endorsed, by the Pope. He defeated a Scottish king, and people are still celebrating it. That would be one thing. They could just be, one of these battle reenactment societies, lovable cranks. Except in the hundreds of years since, this whole thing has, if you like, ossified into a crucible of ethno-religious supremacy. It is a celebration not of the battle itself, but of ethno-religious supremacy over Roman Catholics. It was bad enough when that was a regular feature in the 6 counties in the north of Ireland. But as things have, relatively speaking, with the peace process, calmed in the 6 counties, it seems to have been transmitted over the water and into Scotland. And Saturday was the lowest point yet. Kevin Marr is author of A United Ireland, and a regular guest on my show, and I'm glad to welcome him back today. Kevin, welcome.
Good afternoon, George.
Very, very ugly scenes, weren't they? Hundreds of people chanting, "We hate Roman Catholics," and attacking clergymen. Wouldn't be permitted happening to any other faith, would it?
It wouldn't. I think that's the point, George. I think you make the point very eloquently, that if you were a visiting Martian and somebody explained to you, in a sense, what the Orange Order is and what it does and the impact that it has, both in Northern Ireland, but as you rightly mentioned, in other parts of the UK, and it's in its roots, in its marrow, a sectarian organisation. If you were to explain that to that proverbial visiting Martian, they'd just be utterly nonplussed that in the 21st century this is still going on. I mean, the depiction you have there of the trouble at the weekend, is something out of the 17th century. I mean, it's like the intervening centuries have just disappeared. The problem is that as events in Northern Ireland have progressed politically over the last 20 years, and some of the heat has been taken out of some of the orange marches, and there's a quango, the Parades Commission, which is the oddest bit of public administration in the UK, that governs these things and tries to facilitate orange marches that don't pass through sectarian hotspots in Catholic housing estates and cause problems. Just as Northern Ireland is trying to get past some of these ugly scenes, as you say, they're exported in Scotland, and Scotland's got a very, very big problem with sectarianism at the moment. Most attacks on minority communities are against Catholics. That's been the case for several years now, and it's one of these sort of secret, hidden issues that if this was an organisation baiting the Jewish community or baiting the Muslim community, we'd be hearing a lot more of it. And I think it's absolutely right that we shine a light on it.
Now, it's no surprise that it's a secret in England because, well, it was a secret in England when it was happening in the north of Ireland for a long, long time. What is more nonplussing is that there are many people in Scotland who would like to keep it a secret too. The Police Scotland initial response to the attack on a priest outside the church by an official legal march was being treated as a minor crime. Now it's been upgraded, thanks to social media, to a hate crime. And the Scottish political class, including Labour, for most of the day, evening, and most of yesterday, was also entirely silent about it. It's like people don't want to confront this issue and these bigots.
That's quite right. I think we've internalised so much of this and normalised what is, as I say, in its marrow, rank sectarianism. And I think we've allowed it to become normal. We've allowed it to be characterised as, oh, well, look, it's just those war in Northern Ireland, and therefore different rules apply. Well, different rules don't apply. And I think you rightly point out there, George, that the police have been a bit slow in treating this for what it is. It's a hate crime. It's as simple as that. And either we have these laws covering all communities, or we don't. And I think what's very apparent in Northern Ireland, you can look at this in several ways. The one I often draw attention to is the use of water cannons, where people have been very familiar with scenes of disputes in Northern Ireland over the last 30, 40 years being treated with water cannons, yet water cannons have never, ever, ever been used in Britain, or the British mainland as Unionists would have it. There's a different way of treating Northern Ireland and its issues and its problems, and it just doesn't seep into the mainstream of British politics and British society, which is why you get MPs that frankly ignore all these issues. But I think it's absolutely contingent on Scottish MPs to say, this is we're not having the problem, the very, very worst of the problems of sectarianism in Northern Ireland exported from Northern Ireland to Scotland, because that is the very toxic part of the Troubles, the hatred, the communal supremacy, which is built into the fabric of the Orange Order. And that's not to cast every Orangeman as a belligerent, troublemaker and rank sectarianist, but frankly, their organisation is built upon communal supremacy. It's built upon hatred of Catholics. And the challenge for the Orange Order is to try and accommodate its the parts of its identity which are perfectly fine. They can be proud in their Protestantism, which is at the root of it, but they need to shave off this absolutely noxious part, which has absolutely no future in terms of trying to build any kind of harmonious society, whether that's in Northern Ireland, whether that's in Scotland, or whether that's in the other parts of England where we see these orange parades.
Yeah, I mean, there was one in Newcastle where they have them regularly in Liverpool.
Yeah.
Finally, Kevin, this was all sparked by, not the assault, I don't mean that, but the marching season was kicked off, let me put it that way, by the Chief Minister in Northern Ireland coming over to Scotland to lead an Orange March. This is inflammatory, incendiary, and extremely provocative, isn't it?
This is absolutely right. This is Arlene Foster playing to the gallery, and that's what this is about. This is about her trying to buttress her sort of atrophying political position in Northern Ireland by going back to the base and trying to gain their support and see off any leadership challenges against her, which I suspect are in the post, quite frankly, given the scandal that we learn about every day in terms of the inquiry into the renewable heat incentive, which is the reason, of course, the Northern Ireland Assembly collapsed 18 months ago. Arlene Foster has got some very big questions to answer about all of that. So I suspect she's feeling the political heat and thinks if I go to the base and become the darling of the Orange Lodges, then it might stymie a political move against her. So it's low politics is at the root of this, I guess.
Low politics, but a priest was in fear of his life as he was being attacked. Kevin Marr, thank you very much. Sorry to cut you off because the hour is late and I have other things to turn to. Let's take a quick break. Now, Mick Fealty, a wonderful name in itself, is the editor of the even more gloriously entitled Slugger O'Toole, which takes a critical look at various strands of politics in Ireland and Britain. And he joins me at this late hour in the show. Mick, I'm sorry it'll have to be quite brief, but try and do this for me. Imagine our listeners have all arrived from Mars. Try and explain to them what was going on in Glasgow at the weekend with something called the Orange Order.
Well, a rather disgraceful incident happened. I mean, look, the Orange Order is a Protestant-only organisation that meets throughout the year, does charitable work, but its big thing is marching in July and August. And the big day is the 12th of July. On this occasion, what seems to have happened, is that a Catholic priest temporarily left with his church undefended by the police, was not exactly assaulted, but was spat on not once but twice. Now, I think for most of your listeners, this will sound like an odd episode from the 16th century. But the truth is, both the Orange Order and the tribal hatred that it invokes are not relics of the 16th century, but they are the repercussions of a series of arguments and faction fights, which has brought some of those arguments from the 16th century right up to date into 2018. They are very difficult to explain and very difficult to understand if you're not involved, but they make absolutely perfect sense if you're involved in that whole sort of long-running faction fight, which we see in central Scotland, particularly in the west of central Scotland, but which is to this very day going on right across the length and breadth of Northern Ireland. In fact, only at the weekend, a small Protestant enclave was attacked by petrol bombs by people from the other side. So
this was in Derry, was it? I just heard about this last night.
Yeah. No, there's this very small community of about 300 to 400 people still living on the city side of Derry, all in a very small working class community on the outside of the walls of the historic city. And that's been a site of sectarian conflict for most of the last 50 years since everything kicked off back in 68, 69. And, you know, it's part of the cut and thrust of what happens here. I mean, and I think 30 years of conflict has normalized some of this stuff.
Well, so it's normalised in the 6 counties, Mick, but for it to occur in Glasgow in Scotland with the ugliness yesterday, it wasn't just the spitting on the priest. There were videos of hundreds of people literally chanting, "We hate Roman Catholics."
Yeah.
No. If they were singing that about Muslims or Jews, they would all be arrested, and no such event would ever be allowed to happen again.
Well, according to one statistic I saw, 58% of hate crime in Scotland is against Catholics. Now, I have to say, and you will back me up on this, George, this is not reflective of Scottish society as a whole. These are very small, highly sectarianized games that are played out at very limited times of the year. Though, interestingly, they've taken the anti-sectarian legislation off the books in Scotland because they found libertarians didn't like it, didn't like the way it kind of squashed freedoms. But there is a real problem here. It's ongoing. Often it's calibrated around the football matches between Rangers and Celtic. And I don't know when we're going to get rid of it. We can't do it by legislation. We can't even do it by political leadership because in Scotland, as opposed to Northern Ireland, where there are political vested interests on both sides still playing awkward games around this, every single party from the SNP to Labour to Conservatives have come out and condemned this as an attack on a respected leader of the community in Glasgow. So what political tools Scotland has? I think it's tried legislation. That doesn't seem to work. I think just restitution of the rule of law would be a nice thing to see.
Well, the church should have been better defended by the police, but doesn't it beg the question of banning these orange marches in Scotland?
Well, we've tried that in Northern Ireland, and some parades have been rerouted away from what would be seen now as single identity spaces, i.e. spaces where only Catholics live and only Protestants live. You know Glasgow's geography better than I do, George. And I'm not sure Scotland really wants to go down that route. If you look at the Orange Man's Pledge, it talks about civil and religious liberty and tolerance. And it seems to me that often those values, those self-professed by the members of the order, every summer, and the hotter the summer it gets, the worse the behaviour seems to get, that they forget their own values. And there is a degree to which most ordinary civilized society depends on holding to some of those kind of classic values of a liberal democracy, which is mutual respect and tolerance.
Well, I'll tell you what, Mick.
It should not be a case, George, where any church, be it Catholic, Protestant, or even an Orange Hall, should have to be defended by the forces of the state. Mm. The civilized values of liberal democracy really should be enough, to kind of reinforce some kind of mutual respect.
Well, I'll tell you what, Mick, and I've got to close it there, unfortunately. Having grown up in Scotland of Irish Catholic stock, I never found much mutual respect. Got to say that, I'm sorry to say. I've been George Galloway in for Mike Graham. It's been marvellous for me. I hope it was for you.